Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriel. Welcome to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I'm really glad that you chose to check this channel out. This is an episode in which I have a fascinating discussion with one of the leading scholars in the world on early Islam, late antiquity, and most importantly, the relationships between late antiquity and early Islam. I think you'll really enjoy this. It helps get at some of the important questions regarding the origins of Islam from an academic perspective. So while you're here, why not go ahead and subscribe to this channel and then like this video? I'd be really grateful for that, and spread the word to everyone you know. Thank you and enjoy the episode.
All right, here we go. It is really cool to have Robert Hoyland with us. Hello, Robert.
Nice to talk to you, Gabriel.
Nice to be with you. It's really exciting for me to have this chance to speak about your academic journey, your intellectual journey, and some of your thoughts about the history of civilization. We'll try to be a little more specific than that. So we're just going to have a conversation about, your own formation, but also hopefully get into some of the issues around and behind your work, such as Seeing Islam as Others Saw It from 1997, which has been really a foundational work in the field, all the way up to recent work on things like inscriptions, the Arab conquests. Notice how I said Arab conquests, and other things like that. So I have a very, very short bio to read. If we gave a decent bio that did justice to Professor Hoyland's work, that would take up most of our time together. So friends, Robert Hoyland studied at Oxford with Patricia Crone. And then after a 2-year stint in Jerusalem and Ramallah, he taught back in the UK at St. Andrews, and then back at his alma mater at Oxford. And for some time now has been at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University. And I think you're in New York now, is that right?
Yep, just arrived, yes.
Okay, yeah.
Hopefully for in-person teaching.
Yes, yeah, we just started. When we're recording right now is the beginning of the academic semester at Notre Dame. So we just started in person, and yeah, so getting ready to do the show, the academic teaching show again. I like to begin these conversations just with a question that invites you to speak about your own background, your academic journey. It's interesting how people get into the field of early Islamic studies, late antiquity, Quranic studies. So could you, just share a bit about your own journey?
Yeah, certainly. So I don't actually have any connection with the Middle East, but for my generation, it was a common entry was just the fact that you loved languages, really. So this is before 9/11 or any kind of explosion of Islamic civilization onto the news. And so, I loved languages. I did Spanish, French, German, Latin at school. So Arabic, Persian, Aramaic seemed really exciting things to study. So that was what I went into. In Oxford, that was Oriental Studies.
This was even as an undergrad, your bachelor studies were at Oxford as well?
Yeah. So this is like 1985, 1986. Then I have to say, really, it was obviously personal experience, but Patricia Crone was just hugely influential. I didn't do history much at school. I stopped it at 14, so I didn't go into any depth in it. But she was a very inspiring teacher, and she was very good at always putting things in terms of these great problems and dilemmas that how could we solve this? So she was really real to it. So that was why I think the direction of Islamic history.
I think
strange looking back, but sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to make a comment about Patricia. I mean, probably known to most of our viewers, a great scholar of all sorts of things, actually, not only things surrounding Islamic origins, but other sorts of historical questions. But I would just say those who have met Patricia in person won't forget the experience. I mean, she's very, very powerful, dynamic personality. Of course, has sadly left us, but
yeah. So anybody who has met her will understand that she was an inspirational person to have as a teacher, and especially starting at 18 years old and encountering her, and really a host of wonderful scholars around Oxford at that time. So that was what sent me in that direction, very different from what I originally intended. I was thinking more in terms of being a diplomat and solving world peace, but that didn't materialize.
Maybe it'll all be solved through scholarship. Maybe that's the
Yeah.
that's the approach. Do you have a favorite language?
I do love Arabic. Arabic and French, I always say, are my two favorite languages to both to speak and to read. Just they're both very rich and mellifluous languages. I mean, I love languages generally, so it's many in my time, and
it's like choosing between your children to choose a favorite.
Yeah, and it's particularly when you get to that point. Obviously, it takes a lot of time and hard work when you can actually feel that I can read, access this huge literature. And obviously, Arabic's wonderful for that. We're lucky to have this incredibly rich literature from many centuries time that we can access, and that's very exciting.
Interesting you would name Arabic and French, since one being a Semitic language, another Romance European language, but they each have their own appeal, I guess.
Yeah, there's some depth of, I suppose I quite like also the philosophical, both have quite a rich literary philosophical tradition. Something like Hayy ibn Yaqzan, or if you read, they're actually Sartre, of course, but they're quite philosophical novels. It's a rather nice blend to me, because I love literature, but I also like to be able to think about big ideas, and I think both are good at presenting that to you.
So that's a perfect segue to the next question, because I was going to ask about, so if you were stranded like Hayy ibn Yaqzan, I guess he wasn't stranded because he's born on the desert island.
Yeah.
Anyway, whatever, either stranded or born on a desert island, but somehow magically you could choose just a few books in the field of, Islamic studies, late antiquity, Near Eastern studies. And now I'm thinking of like Western academic studies, or let's say critical studies. We don't have to limit ourselves to Euro-American works, but what would some of those books be? What are the sort of books that shaped your thinking along the way?
So not necessarily Islamic, I think broader.
Yeah, sure. Why not broader? Yes.
What's my happy? It's quite, when you think of 30 odd years of reading, it's it's very rich. So I always, so Gellner, I think he actually straddles the two. Ernest Gellner is a social anthropologist at Cambridge. He did write a book called Muslim Society. He was a structural anthropologist, and he applied those ideas also to that medieval Islamic society. And it's that sort of book, and his thinking is that sort of style where it's irrelevant whether it's wrong or right, and you can pick holes in his society or not, but I find it kind of stimulating. I like those sort of books, putting forward an idea and I can engage with it. I might think you're totally wrong, but at least it's an idea that you can really think about and engage with. I actually really like Michel Foucault, which I teach every now and then a course on historiography, just very, very broad. And Foucault seems to me one of those writers you get more into, because, so particularly his work Surveiller et Punir, it's translated as discipline and punish, but actually surveiller doesn't really mean discipline. It's about monitoring and watching and inspecting, surveilling, use an English count. And it's just these days where we can be watched so much, you really, really kind of can get into it and understand what it means that society it controls you through surveillance, through monitoring, through checking. I sort of scare the students a bit by, if they don't really get it, to say, well, think about it. I have a record on you. I decide whether you pass or fail. I get to choose. And if I fail you, then that's going to have big consequences for your life ahead of you. So this is what surveyor means. It's a real thing. It is about power in a very real way.
And in terms of history, Arabic, Islamic, Near Eastern history, I don't know, Wellhausen, or maybe more recent scholars, I don't know. I don't want to be too obscure, because not all viewers will recognize these names, but Claude Cayen, or were there other historians that sort of shaped your own work on Islamic Near Eastern history?
Yeah, well, Patricia Crowley is obviously a towering force. Read all of materials. Who else I like? Michael Cook, early Islamic dogma was extremely stimulating as an undergraduate. Again, it's that problem we've spent so many years reading a variety of materials to look at. So I got very, I suppose because of my PhD looking at Haiderism, I got very much into the rise of Islam generally. And there's a very, I mean, some of the material is kind of on the wacky side, but again, very stimulating. When I lived
Haiderism, you mean? There's wackiness?
No, I just thinking about, as you well know, there are so many books on rise of Islam.
Oh yeah, right.
One I kind of got into as a personal way, which is Yuda Nevo, who wrote a book called Crossroads to Islam. And I actually, because I did a lot of archaeology in the West Bank, and I got to meet Yuda Nevo. And he actually worked in the Negev in the south and carried out excavations in the area, and just, he was a big thinker, and he had a grand ideas. And one, I mean, his book Crossroads to Islam is quite fascinating, probably totally wrong and always criticized by any respectable academic. But again, it's having a whole concept of how things work, even if it's wrong. It's quite impressive when people come up with a whole way of looking at it. For him, for example, the Roman Empire was trying to get rid of the provinces because it wanted to go
shed away its provinces.
Yeah, so we came up with this whole idea how they gradually handed over to the Arabs, nurtured them not to take over. So that meant there were no conquests or anything like that. And again, as I say, right or wrong, it's interesting when somebody comes up to you with a totally different way of viewing something. I think my favorite fictional literature is actually those sort of sci-fi movies where a whole different world is created by the author that internally makes sense. It's totally fictional, it totally makes sense in a way. And I always find that fascinating.
And he does a lot there. So this is a book, it's Crossroads to Islam. Yeah. So it co-authored by, I think, someone named Judith Corin.
Yeah, she kind of just helped make his English smooth. She was not actually a scholar herself.
Okay. So Nevo makes a big deal about the inscriptions he looked at in the Negev desert. And gosh, I won't be able to reconstruct the argument, but I believe that he sees sort of stages of development in monotheism, and so that Islam develops, continually through maybe 7th, early 8th century. And some of the inscriptions refer to Isa and Musa, to Jesus and Moses, but not to Muhammad. Even 7th century inscriptions, I think, isn't that part of the argument? And so we shouldn't see Islam sort of born fully formed in the early 7th century, but see a process. Or
yeah, I mean, in some ways you could say it's a kind of archaeological counterpart to Haiderism. It's what they want to do in Haiderism, say, what if we only use non-Muslim sources, no Muslim sources? What impression would you get? So Yuda said, well, what if I only used archaeological evidence, no literary material? What picture would I get? And then you do have, for example, this apparent glaring gap that there's no Arabic inscriptions from the Mecca-Medina region after, well, not at all Arabic, but not even inscriptions after 450. However, since you say you're going to interview Ahmed al-Jalad, I'll say watch this space because he's claiming he's found pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions.
We shouldn't give anything away, but
yes. A little advert for Ahmed.
Yeah. Gosh, there's so much I'd like to ask about that, but maybe we'll postpone some of the conversations about that to get when we get to your works. Because I wanted to ask another introductory question about classical authors. You've published so widely in regard to early Islam, pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions, the Syriac Chronicle of Theophilus, and others, other works of Near Eastern Christianity. But who are some classical authors that you think are really just virtuosic in their work, or that you would want to have on your desert island with you?
That's what you mean pre-modern now?
Pre-modern, yes.
Yeah, so I happen to be translating a couple of epistles of Jahiz at the moment. 9th century writer. And if you were on a desert island, the good thing about Punjab is a simple, quick read, and then you put down the book. He's a very rich writer, and you have to really think. Often his works are taken at face value. So he wrote against the superiority of black people over white people, and that's taken as an example of how he wasn't racist. But he always says things tongue in cheek. He directly means you to take that as a literal statement, whatever it's doing. So you really have to read a few times to get a sense of what he really wants to say. So he'd actually be a very rich man to have on a desert island, and obviously incredibly, if you could have his whole works, the Bayan, the Haywan, the epistles, then you've got enough to keep you going for a few years.
Yeah, and Jahiz has a whole theological side to him as well. I mean, he's sort of, at least among those who are in the field of Arabic literature, obviously he's sort of a go-to person for his literary works, but I mean, he had a whole Mu'tazili side to him, in which he engages in the theological debates of his day, and with some, he can have a sharp pen or biting tongue sometimes.
Yeah, and it's kind of, because it's not heavily theological, but it's kind of more epistemological, theological, in the sense of how can we know these things? What are the bases of our knowledge? How will we determine whether something was believable or not? So there's that kind of, again, originally, he's not just going to say, let's talk about this doctrine now. Want to explore that much more deeply, and how can we know that this doctrine might be correct? By the way, perhaps we'll laugh at some of those theologians who are very rigid, so there's also a teasing kind of element to it, which is probably would have been a good guy to have a chat with over a shisha in Baghdad.
You said with the shisha?
Yeah, definitely. If it had been a bit. He probably had his own poison.
Yes. Turning to your own work, I think the inevitable place to begin is with the work "Seeing Islam as Others Saw It," which is not behind me; it's actually in front of me, so you can see it right up there, and is a work of frequent reference for anyone interested in Islamic origins. So I don't know if you want to comment more. I mean, you sort of alluded to your work at Oxford with Patricia and how that led to this project. So maybe you want to elaborate on that. But I just wonder if you have a reflection in light of all of the work that's gone on since then, 20, 23, 24 years, about the task or the prospect of using non-Muslim sources to sketch a history of early Islam. So yeah, a lot of people have been critical of that idea, pointing out that, well, the Christian, Jewish, Samaritan, etc., other sources have their own biases, so why should we trust them anymore? So yeah, anyway, any thoughts about the project, and maybe now looking back at the project, if you have any new perspectives?
Yeah, so there were two kind of main drivers initially. One was historiographical, assessing these different sources, the degree to which we can use them for historical reconstruction. And what I was pointing out was the problems of doing so. The other is evolutional, if you like, evolutionary. Just how do you chart change across a period in a culture? What does it mean? I started out with this image of Heraclius going to Jerusalem, and then Rashid also going off on a long march across the Middle East, and just thinking about the changes across that period. It's huge, huge. So how do you measure that? How do you assess it? How do you think about what are the steps along the way? We rely on these contemporary authors, but so that was what kind of motivated me there. Those two well springs. It was reprinted, the book, recently, and I was asked to write an introduction. And I emphasize that I personally have moved on from that. I now don't really like that idea of separating non-Muslim and Muslim. I don't think I really meant to so much at the time. It was just a case of the non-Muslim sources hadn't really been looked at much at that time.
Right.
Now they have.
Right.
But I have much more of a sense that increasingly over time, Muslims and non-Muslims are occupying the same space. So that means, given the same environment, that there are many commonalities in their culture. The environment always influences you, and for the modern world, it does so enormously. So the separation, total separation especially, makes no sense. And I would prefer to think now, this would be done in other fields, about, you might talk about contemporary sources or later sources, but not separate them according to religious confession. I mean, it says something about our field, unfortunately, that I critically maybe, but followed that we do tend to distinguish rather strongly religiously. Unfortunately, of course, the Middle East does it as well, making quite a clear distinction between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, even though that ought to be meaning really when you're thinking about literature.
Yeah, and I wanted to maybe raise two specific examples from texts that you describe in Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, maybe two of the more controversial ones. And one is the Doctrina Jacobi. So, I mean, I would say a couple of things about it, but I'll probably get something wrong. The dating is, I think, quite controversial, but this is a Greek text which long been dated to the 630s, but I think Sean Anthony has argued for a later date, which is a Christian text, and the story behind it, which is well explained very well in the book, is complicated because it has to do with Carthage and the forced conversion of Jews to Christianity. Anyway, there's the famous passage where someone's come from Palestine and mentions the arrival of the Saracens, and in a way that suggests that Muhammad is still alive, right? So the Jews were overjoyed there. They were proclaiming, this is, I don't know if this is your translation here, so maybe you'll correct this. And they were saying that the prophet had appeared coming with the Saracens, and that he was proclaiming the advent of the anointed one, the Christ who was to come. And this passage has led to work by different people, Stephen Shoemaker notably, who's argued that, then maybe Muhammad was still alive during the conquest. Do you have thoughts about, how we use Doctrina Jacobi, the importance of this text, and this passage in particular?
Well, I have to say, I've kind of got a lot more skeptical about drawing very specific, detailed conclusions about, I mean, someone says a prophet coming with the Saracens, it might sound to us like Muhammad, but that's because, of course, Muhammad became such an incredibly important figure, so we focus on him. But who knows? Certainly the Islamic tradition thinks there are many prophets, and who knows if there were others, or whether it's written more in hindsight. So I must admit, now I tend to want to think more about what does this information does this tell us about the context of the composition itself, really, rather than trying to really go for close historical reconstruction. I'm going to disappoint you there, I'm afraid. I'm not going to say, no, it's definitely Muhammad because of the...
Got it. Yes. Okay. And then, yeah, I mean, it's a difficult text because it doesn't seem to match up with certain Islamic notions, the proclamation of the Christ who was to come. I think there's a mention there that he claims to have the keys to heaven, which doesn't seem to be a sort of major theme in the Sirah literature about the prophet, this notion of keys to heaven. Yeah, and then one other text, and then I no more grilling you about the text of at least attributed to the Armenian chronicler Cebeos, about whom we know very little, I think, and I think I've seen this text referred to as pseudo-Cebeos, so maybe you know if it's really Cebeos or not. I think usually dated to the 660s, has as sort of the backstory that Jews fleeing from the wars between Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire of Iran, they fled into Arabia, they met up with Arabs, they told the Arabs, hey, you guys too are children of Abraham, and they form a sort of alliance which goes on to conquer the land of Israel. I assume this was pretty formative in Patricia and Michael's thinking initially in Hagerism. Isn't there a chapter on like the Jewish Hagarian alliance or something like that?
Yeah, no, it's crucial for them.
Yeah. So what do you make of this passage now? I mean, it's in the book, but I think you've written an article later specifically about Sabaeus, or a book chapter maybe. Yeah. And any thoughts now in hindsight?
So I suppose what I should say, same goes for the Doctrina Jacobi. What I mean is that I take it now that there is a lot more input from both themselves about trying from their own perspective. So for the Doctrina Jacobi, referring to an Arab prophet as the anointed one, is probably reflecting quite a lot about the Christian perspective rather than necessarily assuming it's about the Islamic perspective. And the same for Sabaeus. He does have a lot of good up-to-date information, but he's obviously linking things. So yes, he's heard about the Arab conquests and Muhammad. Yes, he knows about the Jews having to flee from different places. Partly just a really simple fact that they'd supported the Persians, so they're very unpopular. And he's connected the two. But it doesn't mean he's justified. And now I might think he probably isn't justified in connecting them. It's two distinct events. Or at least I'm skeptical about the fact that we could connect them.
That makes sense.
But yes, it certainly was crucial for Hagerism, this particular issue, because it did give them that rather nice close linking, as did the Doctrina Jacobi of Jews and Arabs together. In defense of Hagerism, because sometimes I think people think that I actually opposed it with I was opposing it, argue against it with my seeing Islam. But their aim was very much an experiment, a what-if question. I sometimes tell my students, remember, this is the 1970s, this is big hair and flared trousers, well, hey, let's run with this idea and just think about it now. We're much more cautious and careful, especially 9/11, circumspect about how much we just throw out ideas that might upset other people. Yeah. But they wrote at a time when you didn't have to worry about that. It really was just, let's run with this, have a go. It's just, I know she used those words to me, and it's just an intellectual exercise. People got much too worked up over it.
Yeah, I remember in the preface, there's something, or the introduction, there's something to the effect of, we know that this is going to ruffle some feathers. That's not their wording. And anyway, we know you can't sort of undermine or prevent criticism in a preface or an introduction. I think don't they even say this is a book of infidels for infidels, something like that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
very provocative language.
I can't remember if unbelievers or infidels. Probably infidels. Yes, you're right.
Yeah, but that's a very important point, that there's a methodological exercise, that's being carried out in the work. And since writing Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, you've done so much careful work documenting what we know of the context in the Near East, in late antiquity, early Islam. And people always complain, saying scholars are either working on Byzantium and pre-Islamic late antiquity of the Near East, or they're working on early Islam, but very few people bridge both. You're obviously one of those very few people, or an example that people should look to for bridging those two periods. I wanted to speak about some of your work on inscriptions. Some of your articles on inscriptions are about the early Islamic inscriptions, and then others are about the pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions. Why are these interesting? The pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions in particular, now I'm thinking of, there's an inscription you've written about in a place called Zebed in Syria from 512 CE. Which is Greek, Syriac, I think, and Arabic. I guess the Arabic there is not actually a translation of the Greek text.
No, it's kind of signatures at the bottom of the text.
Okay. And then even more exciting is the inscription in Haran in southern Syria, which I think you have a personal story about and had a role in sort of publishing this for the world. Yeah, so maybe you could speak about the importance of these inscriptions generally for our knowledge of Arabs in Arabia. And I don't know if you have an anecdote about the Haran inscription to share about how you found it. And yeah.
So there's two aspects to that, I suppose. There's one, why did I come to it? In general, my second book on Arabia was, a lot of the time as Islamic historians, especially if we want to write about the rise of Islam, we go backwards from the 9th century sources to try and understand. And that's not ideal. That's not really what you should do as a historian. Ideally, go forward. So my book on Arabia was about going forward. What happens if we step back and try and go in the proper direction of time and go towards Muhammad that way? Can we arrive? Wanted a better context for the rise of Islam, but also it allowed me to broaden out Arabian history as well, because reading backwards, then you only get that Jahiliyyah kind of idea from our Islamic period sources. That tends to lead to tiny little prefaces on Islamic history of a few pages where they tell you, the Jahiliyyah, this is what happened before, in those 4,000 years before Muhammad, summarized in those couple of pages. So it allowed me to try and show the richness of pre-Islamic Arabian history that Muhammad is heir to, which isn't just that, just those funny little wars between people, trivial things. But then for a pre-Islamic Arabia, you get against the problem that your source material is very limited in literary terms. If you really want contemporary stuff, there are no, in fact, historians of pre-Islamic Arabia, lived in pre-Islamic Arabia. So inscriptions become very useful, because these are, along with a few other bits and pieces, are contemporary witnesses. On a personal level, I have to say it also gels for me with a kind of fascination for material objects. I mean, I've worked with things like papyri as well, and archaeological excavations. To me, there's something fascinating with a text that you actually have written by the person's hand 1,500 years ago. So for me, that's particularly fascinating, and that's so it was a mixture of bringing in a new kind of source material to the debate, but also adding, for me personally, that's richness of something that a tangible piece of history, tangible sources.
And could you tell us a little bit about the nature of, maybe you want to go beyond Zebed and Haran, but perhaps starting with those two inscriptions, why are they interesting? How do they help us better to appreciate what the Arabic language was like, not the nature of the language, but the place of Arabic in respect to Aramaic and Greek in 6th century Near East, and whether it helps us understand the big question of who were the Arabs at this point? Was there a notion of an Arab people? Things like that. Yeah, could you comment in that respect?
Yeah, this is for me another fascinating aspect of inscriptions, because it may be very short, and that the Haran inscription is so short, just 2 short lines. But again, there's this rich backstory, because it's being commissioned by this Arab Philak, he's called in the Greek, chief of a tribe, and he wants it to be in Arabic. There's Greek and Arabic. So Greek is obvious because it's the language of the empire, but Arabic, and it's put there first. The Greek goes over onto the other side. So Arabic is actually primary. So this is telling us that this provincial leader out on the edges of the Roman Empire has actually reached the upper echelons. He's a member of the elite that decide that his language appears on the inscription, because it's not usual that imperial languages generally get inscriptions. Besides this, it's only really Aramaic that gets up there. And the other fascinating thing to me is its contemporary, of course, from the birth of Muhammad, who in the Quran is 570. So around the 570 mark, yeah. Okay. And so it's the Quran. In the Quran, it's a big thing is made about the fact that the scripture is in Arabic. It's not being done in a a language which other people might consider more normal. Presumably that's an allusion to Aramaic or Greek. It's being written in Arabic. So it's Arabic's getting its day, if you like. And so the fact that these two things, if you like, Muhammad's also part of this, it's not the right word, phenomenon whereby the marginal provincial group called Arab, controversially, particularly, but let's run with it, Arabic speakers, that they are now more prominent within the Roman Empire. I mean, you could say it's part of a general phenomenon where you start off with say it's happening in America today, we have a more narrower, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite as more immigration happens and as the other peoples want to feel that they should play a part, then it's the languages that start to, maybe one day, you can imagine Spanish being up there with English in the same way as Arabic was with Greek.
So now all of these inscriptions, I'm thinking of Zebed, Haran. There's an inscription in a mosaic in Jordan, right? At Nebo, an Arabic inscription.
So I think it's probably Aramaic, but actually that's controversial.
Oh, it may not be Arabic. Okay.
It's difficult. I wrote an article on it, which I'll refer you to, Gabriel.
Oh, yes. But there's another one in Syria in Jebel Sais or Usais.
Yep. Yeah, Jebel Sais is the
and these are all 6th century.
Yeah, so it's this time where you're seeing Arabic. And in Arabic, so here you kind of need to separate a little bit the language and the script, of course. So Arabic is being written in other scripts before this. Greek script, Nabatean script. And presumably Nabatean Aramaic was the main script used in a while. But this, because it's being used frequently, it actually develops. If Arabic had died out, we wouldn't say it was written in Arabic script. We would say it was written in late Nabatean Aramaic script.
Interesting. That's a really, important point. Right. Yes. Because I don't know this very well, but from what I hear, there's you can sort of see the development of the Nabatean Aramaic script just turning into what we now think of as the Arabic script. Yeah. So, I mean, the big question then, and I think you've thought about this before, is, why now? Why Arabic, the language has been around for thousands of years, has an extremely long history. We know this, I assume, from the names of people, from citations in other scripts of Arabic, etc. But why is Arabic being written now in what becomes its own script?
A number of factors, but I think probably the main driver is the Cold War between Rome and Iran, which is becoming hot, if you like, by the 6th century. Major clashes between them. And what tends to happen, as we know ourselves during the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union, is that the two sides scramble to get other participants on their side. And so the Arabs are one group, one among many, is in Georgia, which also get pulled in. But the Arabs have these pastoralist groups of Arabia. They have one useful thing, which is manpower. Fighting wars, that's really what you need. So because of that, they're willing to give subsidies and titles and extra benefits to pastoralist Arabian tribes. So they become more involved within the empire, and almost inevitably by assimilation, they start to take on some of the aspects, if you like, of this civilization: literacy, patronage of literature, and so on. And the writing, I mean, the language is obviously crucial. It's Arabic, whether you exactly translate that as Arab. So, I agree with a number of writers like Peter Webb. You have to not get our sense of Arab when you watch everyone all the way across from Morocco to Iraq. More limited way, but it's nevertheless, the fact that Arabic is now gaining a higher status, language Arabic, and that's probably giving more of a sense of identity to use it.
What about the idea that the Arabic script is a I don't know really what evidence you'd point to for this, but I've heard the idea that the Arabic script is a vehicle for Christian missions, on the sort of an anonymous.
So that's the other. Yes, if I was going to pick a second, in fact, I had in the first article I actually wrote about this kind of epigraphy and identity. I think I toyed with both of these. One is the political, if you like. But yes, the other is the Christian missionary argument. Just because missionary work by Christians was very much, or the idea was to carry it out in the vernacular. This was true of early modern Christian missionaries as well. Translate the Bible into vernacular languages. So you see at the same time languages like Coptic, Georgian being given extra boost by the fact that Christian texts are now being written in their languages. So I certainly wonder, I mean, unfortunately it's more difficult to prove this, but I certainly wonder whether Christian messages and missionaries into Arabia have, maybe whether just orally or also partially in writing, have Arabic given a boost, if you like, as not only spoken language, but a language that can be used in scripture. I mean, I do actually think that some Christian texts were actually translated into Arabic. The evidence is circumstantial, really. There's two. One is that most of these I think all of these pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions are by Christians. And the second is that the Quran is a really developed monotheist vocabulary. And I think that's because Arabic has been already used, probably by Jews as well as Christians, for theological conversations, like for maybe telling biblical stories, simple discussions, basic discussions about the nature of God. But to my mind, it presupposes that the Quran, it bursts onto the scene with this incredibly advanced monotheist vocabulary. That must have some predecessor, and background to it.
I can't help but ask whether among those texts might have been the Bible. Do you have thoughts on that? Was there an Arabic Bible before Islam?
So I certainly think certain texts, and it doesn't need to be the whole
Genesis to Revelation.
Yeah, exactly. But I would imagine the number of, I mean, some might have been apocrypha, but popular stories, for example. Some of the basic works like Genesis might have been, it's hard to imagine, but as I say, in a sense, Surah 12 of the Quran, it seems to presuppose that people really know biblical stories in this fair amount of detail. So, yeah, I would personally think it's very likely that these portions of the Bible
Right.
in Arabic.
Right. And you mentioned the nature of Quranic vocabulary on just the way that it is sort of soaked through with biblical language. Some of the terms, at least according to most scholars, likely are borrowings, if that's the right term, from Aramaic. Sometimes people speak specifically of Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic, Christian dialect of Aramaic. So if we think of Salat and Zakat, these are sort of maybe a good place to start. Prayer and almsgiving, which are actually written in Arabic with a waw before the ta, with a w before the t at the end. Many would see as a sign of Aramaic origin. I don't know if you have thoughts on that. Also, maybe the word Quran itself because of the ending of the word. Yeah, so how Arabic is the Quran? Does the question even make sense to think in those terms, or what would you say to that?
So there's two things. So Syriac is North Syria and North Mesopotamia. So to my mind, Syriac is not the most obvious, although it's true that during the 6th century it becomes more important as a kind of pan-Christian language for non-Chalcedonians. But the other thing to remember is that Aramaic, it's a broader category, has been used since 500 BC in the Hejaz, with the Nabonidus, the Babylonian king, was there in the oasis of Tamar, and Aramaic has been used then. It's an important language at the time. So before Muhammad, you've got 1100 years of interaction. So I'm quite, and over that time, often it's put in terms of, did this word directly come from Syriac, so it's a really, and sometimes even put the Muhammad took the words from.
Yes, some may know the book of, sorry to interrupt, but some may know the book of Arthur Jeffrey, written maybe in India, I think in the 1930s, where he has this sort of internal conversation for each term he considers, saying, well, yeah, maybe it's from Hebrew, maybe it's from Christian Palestinian Aramaic. This guy makes an argument that it's actually from Syriac, and here's the one I'm going to choose. And he just he chooses the one
So you really have to bear in mind this huge, long period of time that the two languages have been in contact. And the thing is, it goes both ways as well. So, for example, the word used for priest in the area, kahna, doesn't look like it's actually an Aramaic borrowing. It looks like into Arabic, but actually an Arabic borrowing into Aramaic. So this is an organic relationship over a very long period of time. And I think it's part of the way we approach it, which is partly the idea that borrowing shows something negative in a way. It's a bit like approaching English by saying, aha, look, cafe, déjà vu, you've taken this word from French, not a proper language. It's like, it's it's 1,000 years of contact. Yes, of course. But it doesn't mean that it's any less, that the Quran, the language is any less Arabic. The fact that ultimately you say the derivations are from have you read language, sorry, but it doesn't mean it's not Arabic, if you like. Just as my English is no less English because I've got some French words.
Have you read the book Ivanhoe? Have you ever read Ivanhoe?
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah,
long time ago. Yeah, I read it just recently, and there's so much made of whether they're speaking Anglo-Saxon or that they call Norman, but which is French. And it's like it's a very personal, intense, sometimes provocative question, and so I presume
as someone who knows Lebanese Arabic, you must really be aware of how much. I mean, Lebanese Arabic's amazing. Am I speaking English now or French?
Yes, it used to be. I mean, when I began spending time in Lebanon about 25 years ago, it used to be that French was inserted often, and sometimes even Arabic verbs were formed on the basis of French, like yadawbel, cutting someone in line, yadawbel, to double someone, things like that. But now English is all the rage in Lebanon and many other countries. So it's more often like, now they'll say in Lebanese Arabic, Leish ma'angara mak, which means, why are you angry? So I want to get on. We'll just spend about 10 more minutes, and then we'll leave you in peace. But I wanted to, before we leave the question of Arabia and the Arabs and this whole question, could you address, and this will lead us up to the question of In God's Path, but your 2014 work on the Conquests, but where is scholarship on the question of the notion of an Arab people before Islam? If you're an Arabic speaker in what is now Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Syria or somewhere, or Iraq, how would you have thought of yourself? Would you identify with other Arabic speakers, all Arabic speakers, only your tribe? How do you imagine that?
So I feel it's often those who dislike that idea say that, but in the Quran, Arabic is a purely linguistic term. But languages are never purely linguistic. I mean, obviously we're used to the idea now with English being so international, global, that it doesn't impart that much identity. But as soon as you go for a more minority language, see Greeks together, see Latvians together, say Yoruba speakers together, it's an important factor in their identity. Arabic as a minority language of the empire, it would have imparted a degree of identity to my mind. I'm not saying it's the all and end all, but it certainly would have been a factor. The problem usually comes, of course, is that some people think, and some scholars therefore react to, the idea that of making Arab a bit like the modern sense of Arab. Although, to be honest, if you press people on what does it mean to be Arab today, it's actually very, very difficult, because it's not, and they often fall back, well, speaking Arabic. So there is a degree of geography must be there as well, but then there is a physical space environment that those Arabic speakers are inhabiting that also imparted some degree of identity. So I do think there's some identity there. I just wouldn't. I agree that we should go as far as think in terms of the modern day sense of what it's the Arab. And we also shouldn't do the same as 9th century Muslim writers, who tend to have an idea that being Arab was very strong and very extensive. So they try and make all the Yemenis into Arabs as well, those who are living in particular Yemen today, but who spoke and wrote Sabail, form of ancient South Arabian, and will make it really clear in their inscriptions that they're not Arab. They talk about Arabs coming down and staying in their area or being mercenaries in their army, but they are really clear that they are not Arab. So that's sort of all embracing sort of Arab, which is there in our 9th century, so it shouldn't be applied in the 6th century.
And what about, one last question on this topic, what about the Byzantines, for example, the Christians of the Byzantine realm who were not Arabic speakers, so Greek speakers? How did, obviously they're Byzantine provinces, which, you know, Arabia Petrea, Arabia Felix, and I'm forgetting one, Deserta, Arabia Deserta, right? So this term Arabia is there. But was there a notion beyond a geographical term of those sort of, I don't know, it's complicated because not all of the Arabic speakers were nomads. Obviously, there were city dwellers among them, but from the Byzantine perspective, was there an Arab people?
So for them, in some ways, the distinction is citizen or non-citizen.
Okay.
The Saracen are non-citizen. They're those pastoralist groups.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Are on the edges and within, to some extent, bits of the empire, but they are not them. They are uncivilized people as far as they're concerned, and they're not citizens of the Roman Empire. Therefore, you don't really trust them in the same way. There is a term Arab by this time, and it's the people who inhabit Arabia. When you're mentioning Petrea and that's earlier, but since the annexation of the Nabatean kingdom, 105 AD, got this Provincia Arabia, the province of Arabia, and often called the Provincia Araborum, the province of the Arabs. So Arabs, from certainly the Roman perspective inside the empire, Arabs are those people who are part of the province. It's interesting though, so I've been publishing a number of Arabic papyri recently from Messana, which is southern Israel. And very early, so from the earliest texts, it used to be thought there were only Greek ones. I discovered that a number of Arabic ones, which had been somehow mislaid, that there are purely Arabic ones. They're already there from 56 Hijra. And it's interesting that Arabic normal develops. Presumably they're Arabic speakers and have been Arabic speakers for a while. People don't just suddenly start. But what it meant to them exactly, I'd imagine first and foremost they saw themselves as Roman citizens. A couple of the legal texts refer to the fact that this is being performed, this contract or whatever being carried out according to the Roman way. Some ethos Romaicos. So, but presumably being Arabic speakers meant something to them, but it's not easy to get into that. Unfortunately, some of the Arabic sources distinguish between the Rum and the Ahl and Balad. The Ahl and Balad seem to imply locals somewhere. who might have been Arabic speakers. I'm sure it's some factor in promoting some common core for those Christians, Arabic speakers who joined the Arabs. Arabic must have played a part there. But identity is a bit of a nightmare to pin down even in the modern age, when we have very minimal source material.
Yes, yes. Okay. And finally, I just wanted to spend some time highlighting your work in God's Path on the Conquests, which I think has generated a lot of conversation, we put it that way, about the nature of the Conquest. And I mean, it's been a very successful work, and in terms of its reception, but also generated responses, some very vigorous. I think you generally avoid the phrase Islamic conquests there. Could you speak to that a bit? Why were they not Islamic conquests, or do you still see it that way? Or?
That's one of those annoying things. If I say Arab, people jump, he doesn't think they're Islamic. That's not actually what I was trying to do with that title at all.
Okay.
I suppose I'm just distinguishing there between Islamic civilization, which does not occur at the same time. There's not Islamic civilization yet in the 630s. Abu Bakr and Muhammad, so that's a later development. So I'm distinguishing more. I couldn't just say conquest, but of course people say, but which conquest? So I was distinguishing between the conquests by this particular group or whatever, really, and Islamic civilization, which definitely only occurs once they're conquered and actually fully participated. If I'll say Arabian conquerors had held on for a certain time, but then like the Mongols kind of rather disappeared, then you wouldn't be so easily able to speak of Islamic civilization. That input, that blending of ideas from different cultures. That's true of any empire. There's nothing to do with that. Muslims didn't have enough material themselves. It's true of any empire. The great amazing thing about them is the way that they can draw upon this rich diversity of traditions from the conquered peoples, whether that blends with the conquerors.
So you don't mean to downplay religion. There's no sort of argument that religion wasn't important in the conquest.
No. I suppose for me that is, we seem to, I don't know why, but there seems to be this rather narrow idea of what religion is for Islamicists. I think it's just very pious belief, focus enormously on piety. But I mean, to me, religion is never just about piety. There's always some degree of social, economic. It's a very rich and broad term. And what's to some degree striking about Islam is the social dimension to it, the communal dimension. So it had the ability to integrate large numbers of people, very different backgrounds, into a broader geo-cultural civilization, if you like. So I suppose that's partly, to me, I emphasized it because partly as a reaction to that idea of the narrow sense that all religion is about. It's just belief. I mean, Donner rather, I think, laid himself open a bit on this when he has this phrase, I think, at the beginning of his book on Muhammad and the Believers, that religion not to do with, absolutely nothing to do with society or economy or anything like that. He was reacting in terms of not wanting people to think of Arabs as a modern nation, but he really overdid it. Patricia Cromer and her view of that book, particularly what she picked on. That
are you referring here to Muhammad and the Believers?
Yeah, so he has this bit about the Islam with nothing to do with social or economic aspect. It depends a bit, obviously, on your own take on religion. I'm a materialist in the way I approach civilization, in the sense that I take it that we live in this world, that our aspects of our physical environment are important to us. Being able to eat, buy things is part and part of our culture. I don't really distinguish religion from that.
Yes. Yeah, well, this is really, there's so many other questions I wanted to get to, so maybe we'll have to do a part 2 if I can convince you. Yeah, so I'm really interested in more of your sort of ongoing dialogue with Fred Donner about the conquest and Islamic origins. I'm really interested in the idea that, oh, well, you know, the Arabs succeeded only because Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire were worn out from their long battle or war. So it was just sort of lucky timing. So you hear that sentiment sometimes. So, but before we say goodbye, yeah, what are you up to these days? What sort of projects are you working on, and what sort of future projects do you have in mind?
Yeah, so I'm translating some of Jahis, as I said, which I like. I always like having some Arabic translation on the side to make sure I keep involved in the language. I'm actually starting a new archaeological project in North Iraq, Kurdistan, on what was one of the capitals of ancient Adiabene, Erbil, which hasn't really been investigated. It was an important place right up. It was a bishopric.
So do you get
Antiquity.
involved when you do these archaeological projects? Are you like on the ground with a cool hat on, digging in the dirt, looking for shards of pottery and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, so as I said with the inscriptions and the para as well, I really feel I love and feel it's important getting that sense of the material dimension to a culture. It's not only what's in books; it's physical objects as well. And I do love working in the region. I mean, it's got more difficult now. Archaeology is rather fascinating that way. You kind of get to know a community really well, because if you're just a tourist going around, there's talk and chat a bit, but there's a limit to how much you can get into it. But so I worked in Syria for 10 years, stay in this little village of about 40 people, and I got to know them quite intimately. You have a reason to be there because one, you're spending a lot of money, so people employ people and so on. So it's a really nice way of also being able to get to know a community in detail. Yeah, I learned things about prices of cotton and how to catch birds of prey and things like that. I never have learned just in my office in New York.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Robert. It's great connecting with you, and hopefully there'll be a part 2 at some point. But for now, thanks for this conversation, and yeah, I look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thanks, Gabriel. It was really nice talking to you.
Take care.
Bye.
Well, friends, thanks for being with us for this episode of Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I hope you found it to be an edifying discussion. I really hope that you find generally the content on this channel to be useful. There's a really diverse range of things in regard to Quranic studies and biblical studies with top-notch scholars. And we'll be really grateful for your support. So please don't hesitate to like the videos, starting with this one maybe, to subscribe to the channel and to share the news with your friends about exploring the Quran and the Bible.